We're going to look at some of the key drugs used to treat gastric ulcers. We're going to understand the incidence and contribution of infection in ulcer formation. Gastric ulcers are a very serious problem and illness, and these in the past can be life-threatening. The ulcer forms due to erosion of the wall of the gastrointestinal tract, and of course if the ulcer breaks through or causes sufficient damage, you can get substantial bleeding and blood loss from a gastric or duodenal ulcer. Here you can see a picture of a rather nasty ulceration of the duodenum. Causes, well, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, as we'll see in a minute, are a major contributor. These are the drugs like aspirin, ibuprofen, certain hereditary susceptibilities and susceptibility to infection, and the gram-negative bacteria Helicobacter pylori. This was a new discovery that we'll talk about in a minute. Treatment involves drugs that affect gastric acid secretion, antibiotics for eradication of Helicobacter pylori, and usually these are done in a combination treatment approach. Before we can go much further, we have to just have a quick look at the control of gastric secretion from gland cell of the gastrointestinal tract here, and you can see there is this hydrogen potassium pump called the proton pump that pumps hydrogen ions out toward the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, in this case the stomach, and that increases acidity and lowers pH. The drive for the activity of this pump is through various controls. There's stimulation by the parasympathetic nervous system, there's stimulation by histamine through histamine H2 receptors, and there's stimulation by the local hormone gastrin, which is increased in response to food, and increased alkalinity in the stomach triggers gastrin secretion, and the whole process and stimulation of the proton pump is, on the other hand, inhibited by prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are produced from arachidonic acid to produce prostaglandin E2, and that has a suppressive effect on the proton pump and lowers gastric acid secretion. Of course, as we know from our inflammation lectures, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as aspirin, ibuprofen, indomethacin inhibit the enzyme, the cyclooxygenase enzyme that forms all prostaglandins. Prostaglandins that are involved in inflammation, but as well the prostaglandins are involved in the housekeeping functions around the body, and one of those functions is to regulate the gastric acid secretion by controlling the proton pump. Here's just another diagram showing exactly the same regulatory mechanisms, and you can see here the area where we were talking about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, proton pump, but here we have some of the ways that we can reduce gastric acid secretion, and the first line drugs here are the proton pump inhibitors. You can use drugs such as atropine that reduce parasympathetic input by blocking the muscarinic receptors, but these have too many side effects, and these are not the first line treatment. Another treatment which is also used a lot over the counter are the histamine H2 antagonists, and they block the histamine receptors and therefore reduce stimulation of the proton pump. With people that need to take the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, perhaps they have arthritis or other inflammatory diseases that they need to take some of the non-steroidals, they can take a prostaglandin analog, misoprostol, which takes over and takes on the role of prostaglandin E2 because it's an analog and has a negative effect on the proton pump. This is more toward people that are using non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and where other treatments aren't available. Then we'll talk in a minute about antibiotics and the control of Helicobacter pylori.